emphatically no. It's always wrong. That breaks the moral law of God. Well, what happens if there's a tornado that comes through here and all your neighbours have their houses wrecked, and it's a Saturday morning, and really needs be that you go out and rescue your neighbours, and you're going to work harder that day than you've done all week because you've got to start taking houses apart to rescue people out of that. Well, you're breaking the Sabbath. Is it ever right to break the Sabbath? Absolutely, it is. That's where John heard. Third question, when did John hear? When did this happen? So let's look at verse number 10. So what John is now doing, he said, this is who I am, and this is where I was, and this is what happened. And this is the early stages of him meeting the risen Christ and this conversation that takes place. So in verse number 10, he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So when did this happen? It happened on the Lord's day. Now, there's different opinions about what this means. Some people believe, like I think Dwight Pentecost and maybe Walford, they believe that this term, the day of the Lord, I was on the Lord's day, that they equate that term with the Lord's Day, like we've been studying about on Wednesday nights. Now, and I was really open to that. But you know, the book of the Revelation, although it is primarily about the day of the Lord, is not exclusively about the day of the Lord. And when John is having this revelation from Christ, it wasn't the day of the Lord. That was 2,000 years ago. And even in chapter 2 and chapter 3, that's the things that are. That's the church age, which is not the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord happens when we're taken out. If you're going to be technical about it, the day of the Lord would not have begun until chapter 4. So why is he talking about the day of the Lord in chapter 1? So there's just some things there that just don't match up. And I think the other explanation of this phrase, the Lord's Day, is how we would interpret it. And really the churches have interpreted it this way for a long period of time. There's nowhere else in the New Testament where Sunday is called the Lord's Day. This is the only place. But for the Bible to say it one time is good enough. And I think at the end of the first century church, things had established themselves where the Christian church had established a day that really belonged to the Lord in a special way. Look over at the book of Acts again, chapter 20. Now, we've looked at this before, but these are important verses. Acts chapter 20. The Lord's Day, what day would that be? Well, it would have to be the first day of the week. Because, now the Bible doesn't spend a whole lot of time on this, but you'll find it in 1 Corinthians 16, when the collection was to be taken, was on the first day of the week, because that's when the believers met together. And I think this is a very important passage here in Acts chapter 20. If you look down at verse number 7. Look at verse number 6. He says, we sailed away from Philippi. And after the days of unleavened bread, that's Passover, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. Now, why did he abide 7 days? Because he got there on a Sunday night. Of all times to get there, he got there just after church had closed. So he had to wait a whole 7 days. He had to wait a whole week, which is kind of interesting because the believers didn't meet on a Wednesday night. So Wednesday's not the Lord's Day. Now, we don't mind meeting on a Wednesday. The early church met every day. But specifically, he had to wait a whole 7 days until the disciples got together again. Verse 7, upon the first day of the week. So we abode 7 days, and upon the first day of the week, when the disciples... Now you see the word day there, it's italicized. That in the way that the Hebrews would have described the week, the word day is not actually used. It's like the first or the second or the third, speaking of the days of the week. Now the reason I mention this is because Seventh-day Adventists will take that. They actually say this is the first of the weeks after, you get this Pentecost is 7 weeks. It's the Feast of Weeks. It's the Feast of Sevens, or 7 weeks. And they argue that this is not actually the first day of the week. This is the first week after the Passover, which is wrong, because he's already been there a week. Okay, and that's the first, so it's first day. So And there's a whole argument, with Seventh-day Adventists, whether it's Church of God Seventh-day or Seventh-day Advent. There's all kinds of Seventh-day groups that say, well, really, Sunday's not the day to meet. The Sabbath, we're keeping the Sabbath. But when we study the New Testament, we see that the early Christians actually made a very important distinction, that they didn't meet on the Sabbath. Now, Paul would go into the synagogue on the Sabbath and teach them, like at Thessalonica for three whole weeks. Why did he do that? Because that's where they met, and they believed the Bible. So that was his first port of call. He'd always go with the Old Testament, and he would teach the Jews in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. But when they got saved and they came out of the synagogues, they didn't observe the Sabbath. They observed the first day of the week. Now, why would they do that? Because Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. Jesus appeared to his disciples on the first day of the week, and actually a week later when Thomas was there, it was again the first day of the week. And the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, always happens on the first day after the Sabbath. So there's 7 Sabbaths, and then the day after that, which is 7 Sabbaths, is 49 days, and then the next day, which is Sunday, is the 50th day, which is the day of Pentecost. And that's what Pentecost means. So Pentecost, the beginning of the church, happened on the first day of the week. So many important things happened on the first day of the week. But I think the disciples, the believers, did this on purpose. I think that they were trying to send a message to everybody that we're not Jews. We're distinct from Judaism. God is doing something different. And I think they did that on purpose. So anyway, in verse 7, he says, upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. Now, that gives every preacher hope, because we may preach long, but we don't preach to midnight usually. Paul would have preached to midnight. Now, the disciples got together on the first day of the week, and it says to break bread. Now, this could have been the Lord's Supper, but not necessarily so. But I think definitely so that they got together and they fellowshiped. I think probably when they went to church, it was for the whole day long. And they preached and they ate together and they fellowshiped together, and then they'd preach some more. And really it became the Lord's Day. In other words, the whole day was given to the Lord. The first day of the week, this is the first fruits of our week that we're giving to the Lord. Now again, it's an interesting thing that it's the Lord's Day. It's not the Lord's morning. Well, it is the Lord's morning, but it's also the Lord's evening. The first day that God created was evening and morning were the first day. Somebody said to me, well, why do you meet on a Sunday night? Why don't you just meet on a Sunday morning? Well, we do meet Sunday morning, but it's not the Lord's morning, it's the Lord's day, which means it's morning and evening. So I think that's a good principle, that the whole day should be given to the Lord. And of course, it serves also the principle of Sabbath, which we are to rest. You should rest one day a week. That's the principle that God gives to us. But the Saturday thing that's exclusively for Israel. The first time the seventh day was mentioned, even though it's talked about in the book of the Revelation, it was really given to Moses. And the first mention of it to the Jewish people was when they were collecting the manna. He says, now you collect the manna for 6 days, but on the 7th day you won't get any. And of course they went out looking for it anyway. And that was the first time, and this is in the book of Exodus, that the Sabbath was actually recorded for us. But he says in different scriptures, he says, this is a sign between you and your God. This is a sign between Israel and Jehovah. It's not a sign between the church and Jehovah. It is exclusively for Israel. And so it doesn't have any bearing upon the church. You say, well, it's one of the 10 commandments to meet on the Sabbath day. Yep. But again, the commandments were given to Israel. The oracles were given to the nation of Israel. I came to church one morning over the other building. There was a stranger. He only came one day, one Sunday morning. And I went to greet him. And the first thing he said to me, he says, why is it you people meet on the wrong day? And I thought to myself, well, why are you here then if it's the wrong day, And he started to argue that we should be meeting on Saturday. Of course, there's people that believe that. And I think there's probably genuine believers that believe that. And I said to him, well, and he started to say about the commandments, but I said to him, that's part of the ceremonial law of God rather than the moral law of God. And I put it to him like this, and you've probably heard me say this before, but I think it's important. Is there ever a time where it's right to lie? Is there ever a time when it's right to steal? Is there ever a time when it's right or acceptable to commit adultery? And the answer is emphatically no. It's always wrong. That breaks the moral law of God. Well, what happens if there's a tornado that comes through here and all your neighbours have their houses wrecked, and it's a Saturday morning, and really needs be that you go out and rescue your neighbours, and you're going to work harder that day than you've done all week because you've got to start taking houses apart to rescue people out of that. Well, you're breaking the Sabbath. Is it ever right to break the Sabbath? Absolutely it is right. Because there's a hierarchy of needs and a hierarchy of things that are desirable to go on. And saving your neighbour would be over you resting on the Sabbath day. It's the same type of thing that Jesus get into when a person's ox would fall in the ditch. They would get in there and get the thing out. But they criticised Jesus for healing a lame man on the Sabbath day. So in other words, it's ceremonial, but it's not moral. Okay. Anyway, so here we have the church meeting on the first of the week, breaking bread, and Paul preaching to midnight. So we do believe that this is the Lord's Day. And that's what John is saying. He says it was the Lord's Day. It was a Sunday. Now, he probably didn't have other believers to be with. He was probably by himself. He may have been in that cave. He may have been in some other place. But he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And I think that's very telling as well. What does it mean to be in the Spirit? I mean, you'd imagine John, the apostle, would have been certainly walking in fellowship with God all the time. But here was a specific instance where, and I'm just imagining now, he's in a place by himself. Maybe it's outside, maybe it's in a cave, maybe it's in a prison cell. But he was communing with God. And the way this is kind of worded, this is the I use my imagination with these things. I think he's in a space. Maybe there's walls, maybe there's it's probably a private place to some extent, as private as he could get it. And maybe it is a cave or maybe it is a room. And I think he's over by the wall and he's facing the wall. Because when Jesus shows up, he's behind him. If he was in the center of the room, Jesus wouldn't be standing by the wall. So he's in the room, and often you'll do this when you're in prayer. Maybe you get on a seat which is facing the inside, and you're facing maybe the wall, or you're in a corner of a room, and he's in the Spirit. He's fellowshipping with God in a very close way. Someone once said, we must be near to hear. And he's going to hear from the Lord here, but he was already near to the Lord, and he was in communion with God. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet.